These 10 movies, from dark, gritty thrillers to colourful animated films aimed squarely at children, offered up endings that were much darker than they appeared on the surface. They may have posited a superficially happy, closed-off finale for our heroes, but look a little closer and you'll see the less savoury implication that things were far from sewn up, folks. So with that in mind, I am Gareth, this is What Culture, and here are 10 movie endings darker than you remembered. Number 10, Danny, Rusty, and Tess are probably targeted for assassination by Benedict's men. Ocean's 11. On paper, the ending to Steven Soderbergh's Ocean's 11 remake fits the movie's generally breezy tone like a glove. The team pulls off the heist and Danny completes a stint in prison for violating his parole, before driving off into the sunset with Tess and Rusty. People tend to forget though that the final seconds of the film also contain a darker implication, as we fleetingly see two of villain Terry Benedict's bodyguards watching the trio drive off and promptly tail them. On the movie's DVD commentary, Soderbergh and screenwriter Ted Griffin discussed the ending, Griffin explaining that friends of his were left confused, believing that the bodyguards had been sent by Benedict to assassinate the three. While this obviously didn't happen as 2 sequels were eventually released, Griffin said he regretted not writing a small beat to clarify the ending, where the bodyguard's car conks out due to one of the heroes tampering with it, in turn getting rid of any potential ambiguity regarding the hero's fates. As it stands though, watched in a vacuum anyway, it sure as hell seems like the bodyguards are gearing up to clip Danny, Tess, and Rusty. Number 9, the polar bear totally eats Yona and Timmy, Snowpiercer. Bong Joon-ho's terrific sci-fi actioner Snowpiercer ends on what appears to be a somewhat optimistic note, as the titular train is derailed and apparent sole survivors Yona and Timmy step out into the tundra. In the film's final moments, they spot a polar bear in the distance, suggesting that life does in fact exist outside of the train, providing a faint glimmer of hope for both their own survival and humanity's as a whole. That is, until you consider the more grim probability that Yona and Timmy are about to get devoured by a likely very hungry polar bear. Given that they've spent their entire lives on board the train and have nothing in the way of defensive capabilities, there's absolutely nothing they'll be able to do if that bear, which isn't very far away at all, comes their way, which it probably would. And even if they're not eaten by the bear, they've got little in the way of basic survival skills to endure the harsh elements, find food, and create shelter for themselves. Either way, they're toast, right? Number 8, everybody forgets about Amanda, Taken. The original Taken may be the best of the increasingly absurd trilogy, and with its depiction of former CIA operative Brian Mills employing his special set of skills to rescue his kidnapped daughter from an Albanian sex trafficking ring, it's also inherently the darkest of the 3 films. It's no secret that Brian kicks all of the ass and saves his darling daughter Kim at the end, serving up a cathartic happy ending for popcorn-gobbling audiences, while totally glossing over the more horrifying truth of Brian's revenge crusade. A subplot earlier in the movie revolves around Kim's friend Amanda, who is also kidnapped alongside her. Tragically, her corpse is later discovered by Brian, dead from an enforced drugs overdose. And yet, the end of the movie gives not a second thought to poor Amanda and her presumably devastated family. Amanda was nothing more than a prop, a plot device the film forgets about the second she's exhausted her function, to show the grim fate that Brian must save his precious Kim from. The ending may be a fortuitous one for the Mills family, but the outcome is still a net negative. Amanda's dead, her family are left grief-stricken, and there's a bunch of other trafficked young girls whose fates are left totally up in the air. Great. Number 7, the mutant children's safety is far from certain, Logan. There's no denying that Logan's ending is a bittersweet one, as the titular superhero sacrifices himself to protect Laura and the other mutant children, allowing them to cross the Canadian border to apparent safety. The film treats Canada as a sure haven for the mutants, and while it's entirely possible they are safe once they enter the country, it's also far less of a sure thing than the movie seems to suggest. For starters, the mutants only think there's help waiting for them there. They've got no guarantee whatsoever, have they? And while the film obviously plays off the stereotype that Canada is a more liberal and accepting place than the US, the country has its own pervasive history of racism and prejudice, which is a far cry from the sunnier outlook implied by the film. Obviously, nowhere on Earth is an idyllic paradise free of bigots who hate outsiders, but ultimately the mutants' quest for safety and freedom is far more of a crapshoot than the fixed, definite outcome posited by the film. And while on the subject of Logan, I want to know, is this your favourite Hugh Jackman performance? And if it's not, you let me know what is in the comment section down below. Number 6, Andrew is doomed to a tragic fate, Whiplash. Damien Chazelle's expertly assembled drama Whiplash ends on such a cathartic display of jazz drumming skill from protagonist Andrew that it's easy to get swept up in the sheer majesty of it, while forgetting its more unsavoury implication. Yes, Andrew gives the performance of his young life to date and finally earns the approval of sadistic jazz instructor Terence Fletcher. But at what cost? Look past Andrew's satisfied smile and the brilliance of his final performance, and we have a young man who has cast his humanity aside in pursuit of his obsession, pushed to excellence on a foundation of abuse, yet utterly broken inside. Director Chazelle even suggested in interviews that Andrew was likely being pushed towards a tragic fate. As he put it, Fletcher will always think he won and Andrew will be a sad, empty shell of a person and will die in his 30s of a drug overdose. I have a very dark view of where it goes. Star Miles Teller had his own slightly less depressing view of how Andrew ends up, but it's still extremely bleak compared to the vibrancy of that final performance. He said, "I think Andrew lives a pretty lonely existence, just working on his craft and becoming one of the greatest drummers of all time, but being pretty miserable and alone. People say you are probably gonna die alone. That's Andrew." Seems pretty gloomy either way, really. Cheers for tapping on this video today, my friend, and if you're enjoying what you're watching, then hit that subscribe button down below for more of this what culture stuff in your day. Number 5, the cycle of revenge will continue. Kill Bill Volume 2. Kill Bill Volume 2 delivers by far the most sentimental and outwardly happy ending of any Quentin Tarantino movie, as Beatrix Kiddo kills Bill and is finally united with her and Bill's daughter, Bibi. It certainly feels like a well-deserved outcome for the two, until you consider that Beatrix and Bibi aren't remotely out of the woods yet. Volume 1 heavily implies that Vernita Green's daughter Nikki might one day seek revenge on Beatrix for killing her mother, as Tarantino later confirmed would form the basis for a potential, if at this stage incredibly unlikely, third film. As such, it's easy to consider a future where Beatrix, having let her guard down after years without conflict, is caught unawares by an adult Nikki, who ends up making short work of her. And even this presumably isn't the end of the story, as a grown Bibi will then vow to take revenge against Nikki, ensuring the soulless cycle of revenge simply continues. Number 4, the aliens are probably coming back to wipe out humanity, District 9. Neil Blomkamp's Best Picture nominated sci-fi classic District 9 appears to conclude on a fairly hopeful note, as alien Christopher Johnson is able to escape Earth with his young son CJ, while promising Vickers, who turns into a prawn by film's end, that he will return to cure him. But even if Christopher was telling the truth and is indeed able to cure Vickers, it's far from a guarantee that he will ever actually return. More to the point, once Christopher gets home and informs his fellow aliens of the situation on Earth, that their kind are confined to a camp and viewed with disdain by most humans, it's easy to imagine a scenario where the aliens stage a full-on invasion of Earth. The aliens will return, but only to rescue their own kind, and seek revenge on the humans who treated them so poorly. Revenge again! Even if Christopher has only the best intentions, he'll likely be unable to quell a tidal wave of homicidal alien rage, helpless to stop them from unleashing their superior weaponry upon the human meat sacks. And while District 9 doesn't paint a remotely flattering portrait of Earth and the people on it, it's still an undeniably bleak outcome for the human race. Number 3, Josh basically ruins Susan's life, Big. The Tom Hanks starring comedy Big is one of the most beloved films of the 1980s. And with damn good reason. Hanks stars as Josh Baskin, who at the age of 12 wishes to be made big, and wakes up in the body of his adult self. Josh ends up scoring a gig working at a toy company, and his free-spirited personality soon enough wins him the affection of co-worker Susan. Their seemingly happy relationship crashes into a brick wall at film's end though, when Susan learns the truth and watches Josh turn back into a child. Though he suggests she should use the fortune teller machine to turn herself into a child alongside him, she decides that being a kid once was enough and remains an adult. It's a wonderfully bittersweet ending on the surface, albeit one with far more unsettling psychological implications when you think about it for a moment. Beyond the fact that Susan is now aware that magic definitely exists, she also has to contend with the fact that she's been in a relationship with a boy in a man's body, and more to the point, has been having sex with this person. Yep, this film hasn't actually aged that well, has it? Given that she only half-jokingly tells Josh to look her up in 10 years, she's not only heartbroken, but clearly had her frame of reference for romantic relationships completely annihilated. How is she supposed to go about having a normal life now? Perhaps worst of all is the fact that she's also unable to speak to anyone about this traumatic series of events, because they would surely believe her to have lost her mind. She has to try and get on with the rest of her life while walking around with this game-changing knowledge of the universe. And that'd set even the most sane person up for a nervous breakdown at some point. Number 2, Healy resumes his self-destructive alcoholism, The Nice Guys. Shane Black's ludicrously entertaining and criminally underseen neo-noir The Nice Guys ends with Healy and March's case effectively falling apart, the Detroit automotive industry having successfully suppressed the catalytic converter for now. The film's final scene sees Healy and March meeting up in a bar to drown their sorrows, with functioning alcoholic March happily telling Healy, "At least you're drinking again," to which a sozzled Healy replies, "I feel great." While an undeniably hilarious exchange, it's also important not to trivialize the fact that Healy abstained from alcohol consumption throughout the film, and by falling off the wagon so spectacularly and now forming a new detective agency with an enabler like March, is likely headed down a path of self-destructive alcoholism, though the ending sets up a sequel that nods to the pair's continued adventures, which due to the film's paltry box office will sadly never get, though we definitely should. The far more likely outcome is that Healy ends up drinking himself into destitution, if not an early grave outright. Number 1, Mike and Nancy definitely got eaten. Sing. Illumination's musical animated film Sing features numerous memorable anthropomorphic, musically talented animal characters, including the street musician mouse called Mike. Though in the film's climax, Mike gets his moment in the spotlight when he performs a spirited rendition of Frank Sinatra's My Way. His final scene in the movie hints that he's actually not long for this world. Mike ends up tracked down by 3 Russian bears he's cheated out of money during a card game earlier on, though is at first rescued by his mouse girlfriend Nancy. Yet as the pair drive away, one of the bears is shown still clinging to the back end of the car, grinning at the camera. And that's the last we see of Mike and Nancy. They are totally absent when the Moon Theatre is reopened right at the end of the movie, leaving audiences to assume that at least Mike and probably also Nancy were killed and eaten by the bear. Kids film this, and while many fans speculated that the sequel would reveal Mike and Nancy to be alive, given that neither of the characters were ultimately present in that picture, we'll have to assume that they were probably devoured as they drove off into the sunset. Grim.